It took me some time to find the courage to remember this story. That early morning, the rain was falling so hard it seemed to want to erase everything that had happened in that house. Even today, when I hear thunder, I remember the last thing we saw before realizing we were not alone. Everything started like any young people's party. Loud music, laughter, a full pool, and that feeling of freedom that only exists when no adults are around. But at some point that night, something changed. First came the silence, then the disappearance, and then we found that Sneaker lost in the mud. If I had known what we would find shortly after, I would have begged everyone to stay inside the house, because that night someone was watching us, and he had already started playing with us. My name is Sarah. At the time I was 18 years old and was about to start college in September. It was July, vacation time, and my friend Carla decided to throw a big pool party at her house. It wasn't exactly a graduation party, but it had that same farewell feeling before everyone went their separate ways. Carla's house was perfect for that. Her parents traveled a lot for work and spent weeks away. Many times she stayed alone on that huge property, which was almost like a small farm. It had a gigantic backyard, a pool, an orchard, and a wooded area right after the property line. That's why whenever someone wanted to organize a big party, Carla's house was the place. She invited around 15 people from our class. But anyone who has been to a young people's party knows how it works. One guest invites another, who invites another, and when you realize it, the house is full of people you've never seen before. My friend Jonas and I were the first to arrive. We lived nearby and wanted to help Carla organize everything before the guests showed up. At first, everything was calm. We set up some tables near the pool, turned on the music, and put the drinks on ice. The night was warm and the sky completely clear, the kind of night perfect for an outdoor party. When the first guests started arriving, most of them went straight to the pool. Some had brought swimsuits. Others simply jumped into the water in their underwear or shorts. The music started playing louder. People laughed, talked, drank, and soon the pool area was full. Carla's house had a lot of space. Those who didn't want to get in the water stayed sitting around the pool or walking through the yard. Some gathered near the speakers. Others talked near the orchard trees. It seemed like a perfect night, but around midnight, something started to get out of control. People none of us knew began to show up. At first, we didn't pay much attention. We thought they were friends of friends. But then it started to get strange. Some of those people clearly weren't from our school. They weren't even with someone we knew. They simply walked in, as if that house were public. Carla got furious when she realized it. She had made it clear from the beginning that she didn't want strangers at the party. It was her parents' house, after all. But when we looked around, there were more than 30 people there. Many unknown faces, and controlling that was already becoming difficult. Some of those people were drunk, others wandering through the yard as if they were exploring the place. That's when Carla decided to do something. She started asking everyone who hadn't been invited to leave. Some of our friends helped identify who was from the school and who wasn't. The strangers began to be kicked out. Some left without complaining, but others got angry. Some people insulted Carla before leaving. A few said things like, "This won't end like this." At the time, no one took it very seriously. After, it was just drunk people being kicked out of a party. But today, looking back, I can't help but think that maybe that was the moment when everything started to go wrong. Around 2 in the morning, we finally managed to get all the strangers out. The party continued for a while, but it was already losing its atmosphere. Some people left. Others stayed talking near the pool. And then, about an hour and a half later, the blue and red lights appeared in front of the house. The police. Someone had reported that there were minors drinking and using drugs there. The officers spoke with Carla. They knew her family and knew she wasn't a problematic girl. But they said it would be better to end the party. If her parents found out there had been alcohol and so many people in the house, the situation could become much worse. So Carla turned off the music. Slowly, everyone began to leave. When the cars disappeared down the dirt road, only the 6 of us remained. Me, my boyfriend Roberto, Carla, her boyfriend Marcelo, Jonas, and his girlfriend Simone. We decided to sleep there and help Carla clean everything the next day. Actually, that moment it just seemed like the end of a long party. But while we sat in the living room talking, the sky began to change. Dark clouds covered the moon, the wind increased, and in the distance, we heard the first thunder. I still remember the strange feeling I had at that moment. Anyone who has spent nights in rural areas knows. When the weather suddenly changes, the night seems different, as if nature itself is warning that something isn't right. Shortly after that, Jonas took Simone by the hand and said they were going for a walk outside. They went out to the porch. A few minutes later, we began to hear the 2 of them laughing and kissing. We started laughing too. They realized they were being heard and decided to go farther away, so they walked toward the orchard. The last thing we saw was their silhouettes disappearing among the trees. Archie, that moment, no one imagined that would be the last time we would see them alive. After Jonas and Simone walked toward the orchard, we continued talking in the living room. At first, no one worried. The house was still filled with the smell of drinks, pool chlorine and the wet earth from the yard. The music had already been turned off, and that silence after a big party always feels strange. The wind outside began to grow stronger. We could hear the leaves of the trees colliding with each other. From time to time, the sky lit up with distant lightning. The storm that had seemed far away was approaching quickly. Even so, we stayed there laughing and remembering some situations from the party. Occasionally, we could still hear Jonas and Simone outside, but after a few minutes, everything became silent. First, was normal. They had probably gone deeper into the orchard for privacy. But time passed, the conversation faded, and the storm finally arrived. The rain began suddenly, heavy, the kind that makes noise on the roof and turns the entire yard into mud in just a few minutes. I looked at the clock. It was already close to 4:30 in the morning. That was when I noticed something that made me uncomfortable. Jonas and Simone still hadn't come back. At first, I tried to ignore it. Maybe they were sheltering under a tree waiting for the rain to slow down. Even so, I got up and went to the porch. The rain was falling so hard it was almost impossible to see the yard, but even so I started shouting, "Jonas, Simone." My voice was lost in the sound of the storm. Roberto also appeared behind me and started calling, "Jonas, Simone." Nothing. No response. Marcelo then said something that seemed to make sense at that moment. He told me to relax. He said the 2 of them were probably hiding under some tree and would return as soon as the rain stopped. According to him, there was no point going out in that storm looking for them. So he suggested we get some sleep. If they still hadn't returned when we woke up, we would go look for them. At that moment, it seemed reasonable. I was tired. The night had been long. So Roberto and I went to one of the guest rooms. Carla and Marcelo went to her room. I still remember that before falling asleep, I stared at the ceiling for a few minutes, listening to the rain falling. A strange feeling wouldn't leave me alone. Something inside me said Jonas and Simone should have already returned. But I eventually fell asleep. When I woke up again, the rain had already stopped. I looked at my phone. It was around 11:30 in the morning. The sky was still dark and heavy, like it is after a strong storm. I got up and went to the living room. Everyone was already awake, but something was wrong. Jonas and Simone were not in the house. At that moment, the silence in the room felt different. Now, it didn't just feel strange. It felt wrong. We ate something quickly and decided to go out to look for them. We started with the orchard. The ground was completely soaked. The soil had turned into mud because of the rain during the night. We walked between the trees, calling their names. Jonas, Simone. But there was no answer. We searched the entire orchard. Nothing. That's when Roberto shouted from the other side. Here, I found something random. On the ground half-sung was one of Jess's sneakers. Just one. The other wasn't there. I felt a chill run up my spine at that moment. But there was something even stranger. There were no footprints. The rain had been so strong that it erased any trace they might have left. Even so, looking around, we noticed something. The orchard ended near the forest, and it seemed like they had gone in that direction. I didn't like that idea at all. The region had a reputation for having jaguars, and at that moment the possibility of an attack crossed my mind. Even so, we had no choice. If they had gone into the forest, we needed to search there. We entered among the trees. The vegetation there was denser. The ground was slippery because of the rain. And with each step the silence seemed heavier. We kept shouting their names. But no one answered. After almost an hour walking through the forest, Roberto suddenly stopped. I realized immediately that something was wrong. His face lost its color. He raised his hand and told us not to look. His voice was shaking. Don't look. Let's get out of here. Now, my heart started beating so hard it felt like I could hear it inside my head. I asked what was happening, but he only repeated that we needed to leave immediately. Carla then asked directly, was it Jonas and Simone? Roberto didn't answer. He just grabbed my hand tightly and started running. We ran after him, crossing the forest as fast as we could. When we finally left the trees and reached the house again, he stopped. He looked straight into my eyes and said something that almost made my heart stop. We need to call the police. At that moment, a huge fear took over me. I asked what he had seen, if Jonas and Simone were dead. Marcelo asked too. Carla insisted. We all wanted to know. Then Roberto finally spoke. Yes, he had seen both of them, and they were dead. Marcelo put his hands on his head and immediately said, "Damn jaguars." But Roberto shook his head and said something that still gives me chills when I remember. It wasn't jaguars. I asked what it had been then. Maybe a snake, some animal. But Roberto answered with a voice that seemed not to believe what he was saying. It wasn't an animal. It was someone. Someone did that to them. And the way they were, I wouldn't say it was a normal person. After Roberto said that, a heavy silence took over all of us. No one spoke for a few seconds. It was as if our minds were trying to accept something that simply made no sense. Someone had killed Jonas and Simone, and if Roberto was right, that person could still be nearby. We went back to the house as fast as possible. I felt my heart pounding in my chest as we crossed the yard, still wet from the rain during the night. As soon as we entered, Marcelo told everyone to get inside quickly. The first thing Carla did was run to the phone to call the police. But the moment she picked up the receiver, she noticed something strange. There was no signal. The phone was completely silent. I tried to imagine a logical explanation. Maybe some tree had fallen on the wires during the storm. But Carla looked around the house and said something that made the fear grow even more. If that were the case, we would also have no electricity, and the lights were working normally. That was when Marcelo noticed something. Roberto was no longer in the living room. Immediately, panic took over me. I started shouting his name through the house. Roberto! Roberto! For a few seconds that felt eternal, no one answered. Then he appeared at the door of the living room. He told me to calm down, but his face was serious. Much more serious than I had ever seen. He said something that completely changed the atmosphere inside that house. We needed to lock everything, doors, windows, any entrance, now, without wasting time. We started running through the house, closing everything that could be closed. We locked doors, windows, and even some curtains. When we finally returned to the living room, Carla asked what was going on. Then Roberto explained. All the tires on our cars were slashed. Someone had done that. I felt a huge urge to cry at that moment. If someone had slashed the tires, then that person didn't want us to leave. Carla asked why someone would do that to us. But Roberto only said he didn't know. Then he asked if her father had any weapon in the house. Carla answered yes, a hunting rifle. He asked her to go get it immediately. Carla returned a few minutes later bringing the rifle and some ammunition. Roberto armed himself and started thinking of some way for us to get out of there. But it seemed like everything was against us. Shortly after that, a new rain began, and Carla remembered something that made the situation even worse. To reach that property, you had to cross a small stream. If the rain continued strong, the stream would fill up, and the road would become impossible to cross. Marcelo then said that maybe the only option was to wait for the rain to stop. Even with all the fear we were feeling, there was no other choice. Hours passed, and nothing happened. The silence of the house seemed heavier every minute, until around 7 in the evening. The lights went out. The entire house plunged into darkness. Carla and I hugged each other immediately. Roberto tried to calm us down and asked if there were flashlights in the house. Carla said yes. Marcelo grabbed 3 flashlights from a drawer and distributed them among us. After a few more hours in that tension, Marcelo shouted. He said he had seen someone in the window. All of us froze. Roberto asked for silence. He pointed the rifle toward the stairs. For a few minutes, nothing happened until we heard a sound coming from upstairs. It sounded like a low laugh. Soon after came footsteps. My whole body started shaking. Roberto whispered for us to stay quiet. He began walking slowly toward the stairs. Then something fell from above. It rolled down the steps and stopped right in the middle of the living room. Marcelo pointed the flashlight, and then we saw it. It was Jonas's head. Carla and I started screaming and crying. Marcelo panicked. He ran to the door and went out to the road. Carla shouted for him to come back, but he disappeared into the darkness. Roberto covered Jonas's head with a cloth so we wouldn't have to look at it. Then he started going up the stairs with the rifle pointed. Carla was worried about Marcelo. She said she needed to go after him. I tried to stop her, but at that moment the door opened again. Marcelo was back. Carla ran to hug him, but something was wrong. She felt something warm on her hands. When she looked, she saw blood. Marcelo tried to speak, but he began coughing up blood and fell to the floor. A huge knife was stuck in his back. That was when I heard 2 sounds at the same time, Carla's quiet crying and a laugh, cold, coming from the door. A man was standing in the entrance of the house, laughing. He slowly walked inside. He stepped around Marcelu's body and pulled the knife from his back. I pulled Carla back and shouted for Roberto. The man started walking toward us. I asked who he was, why he was doing that. He just laughed. Then a gunshot echoed through the house. Roberto had fired from the top of the stairs. The shot hit the man in the chest. He took a few steps back, as if he couldn't believe what had happened. Another shot came right after and hit his head. The body fell heavily onto the living room floor. For a moment I felt enormous relief, as if everything had finally ended. But when I looked again toward the top of the stairs, something made my blood run cold. There was a shadow behind Roberto. I shouted to warn him. He turned just in time to raise his arm and block an axe strike that came down toward him with force. The impact was so strong that both of them lost their balance and began tumbling down the stairs. They hit the steps and fell onto the living room floor. The man attacked Roberto violently, landing a hard punch on his face. I grabbed the rifle that had fallen on the floor, but my hands were shaking so much that I couldn't even aim properly. I had never held a gun before. My heart felt like it was going to jump out of my mouth. Carla snatched the rifle from my hands before I could do anything. She raised the weapon and fired into the man's back. The sound of the shot echoed through the entire house. The man let out a strange grunt and slowly turned toward her, as if he still had the strength to react. Carla pulled the trigger again. Another shot hit the man. Then another, and another, and another. She kept shooting until his body finally collapsed and stopped moving. The silence that came afterward felt even more frightening than the gunshots. Carla was shaking and breathing fast. Roberto slowly approached and took the rifle from her hands. Carla seemed completely in shock. I could still hear the echo of the shots inside my head. The house was destroyed, and the smell of gunpowder mixed with blood made the air heavy. No one knew exactly what to say at that moment. We decided to wait for dawn. Roberto managed to check the phone again and realized the wires had been cut. After some time, he managed to improvise a temporary repair. His hands were injured, but even so he managed to make the call. When I finally heard the operator's voice on the other side of the line, I felt enormous relief. We called the police and explained everything that had happened. On the other side of the line, the voice sounded incredulous. The road was practically blocked because of the rain and the stream that had overflowed. They said they would do their best to reach the property as soon as it was safe to cross. The following hours were the longest of my life. We sat in the living room in silence while the weak morning light began to appear through the windows. No one had the courage to go upstairs again, nor to look too much at the bodies on the floor. Around 6:30 in the morning, we finally heard the sound of vehicles approaching along the dirt road. The sirens broke the heavy silence of the property. When I saw the police cars and the ambulance entering through the gate, my legs felt weak with relief. Paramedics entered the house quickly and began attending to us. Roberto was taken to the hospital because he had some serious injuries on his arm and face. Carla and I received treatment right there. I was still trembling when I tried to explain to the officers everything that had happened that night. The police investigated the house and the forest area for hours, but there was something very strange about that case. The men who had invaded the house had no kind of documents, no identification, nothing that could say who they were. Even stranger, their fingerprints did not exist in any database. It was as if those people simply did not exist to the rest of the world. The officers said they would continue investigating, but I could tell by their looks that they might never find answers. Months later, Roberto moved to another state because of a job. Before leaving, he promised that he would come back to get me when everything was calmer. As for Carla, the last time I spoke with her was about 5 years after that night. 6 years have passed since that early morning, and even today, when I remember that house and that party, I ask myself the same question. Did those men really choose that night by chance? Or were they watching us long before everything began? Good night.